the general sense that I've encountered when I've started to talk about facial recognition has been a little bit like this, a sort of broad anxiety, a sense of not really knowing very much about it, but knowing that there's an apprehension, that there's a concern about how this technology is used and the way in which it works. What I want to try and do is to focus on the fundamentals of a sort of standard system. Now, in particular, I'm going to talk more about commercial applications of facial recognition than the law enforcement. And there's a couple of reasons for that that I'll sort of talk about in a bit more detail. But essentially, there's a different legal regime that applies if it's the police or another organisation like that are capturing the images for law enforcement purposes, compared to the approach that's often taken by businesses if they're deploying it in a commercial or some consumer-facing context. These are the various sort of areas that I'm going to talk about. And I want to start just really with sort of talking about how it works, not assuming that any of you will have necessarily a very technical background, but using this, which is from a particular product that I don't have any connection with, OpenFace. And what you can see here is the different phases of the capture and analysis that goes on with the image. And the first thing to note is that these are images that are being captured normally out of a field of other faces. So often it will be in a crowded environment, so it might be the entrance to retail premises. In police cases, it's often in big crowd environments, so sort of football stadiums, public walkways, things like that. And so there's a technical challenge around getting high-resolution images of individual faces and collecting those, but then also recognising that what you've got is a face, and that's the second stage, the detection stage. That highlights individual faces, and then there's a processing that goes on, a transformation. What that does is, you see all of those individual sort of black dots in the pictures. It's taking measurements. It's working out what's the distance between the chin and the top of the eyebrow, what's the distance between the side of the eye and the edge of the ear. Now, that's quite important to understand, because that is transforming image data into a different category of data called biometric data. Biometric data, and that's a term that might be familiar to you from passports, is data that basically reduces to sort of mathematical form distinctive characteristics of individuals. And in contrast to image data, biometric data is data that's treated as being a special category of data for the purposes of data protection law, and we'll come back to that. Just following this process through before we move on, the cropping stage is also important. What that does is it ensures that each individual record only preserves the information about the individual that they're considering for that moment in time. It's taking out all of the details of anyone else that might be around them. And so for that individual, the only record that's created doesn't have any superfluous personal data or information about others. Now at this point, all that you've done is, to some extent, a sort of slightly sophisticated CCTV capture, which a lot of businesses will already have in place and have already considered the impact of. But after this, you get into the stage where the artificial intelligence comes into effect. And so you've got the deep neural network, an algorithm which analyses that set of biometric information, normally against a watch list, so a database of individuals that you are looking out for various reasons. Now, that might be in a retail environment, people who've previously been excluded from the premises because of shoplifting, or because they were abusive or assaulted a member of staff or another customer. In other environments, there might be other controls. It might be the other way around. You might be using it for access control in a sensitive environment. So you might require anyone who has a particular security clearance to provide their facial biometrics, and then when they want to gain admission, some other form of identity, a near-field chip or a pass card or something like that, would be scanned in conjunction with a facial scan before they were given access to the sensitive area that was being protected. So these are the sort of ways in which it might be applied. But one way or another, what you're looking for is a match between what you've just captured and something that's in a data set. Anyone that doesn't match the people in the data set, their data is almost always immediately just deleted, or certainly sort of ring-fenced and sort of stored away in a way that's not easily accessible by anyone in the future. And that is because those individuals are no longer of relevance. It's a slightly different approach again in the sort of security system, because they're the people who've presented themselves at the barrier and who haven't been detected are probably the ones you're most interested in. But normally there would be an intervention at that point, where an alert would sound and a human would approach them and find out what they're doing there. But that process of comparison almost always, one way or another, leads to, if you've got a detection or if you've got a negative result that is what you're looking for, triggering something that involves a human. What you don't really want to have, and again, we'll sort of come back to the reasons for this, is a system that is making decisions in the system. So where the AI is actually making a determination about the individual. It's the difference between the AI calling the police and saying, this person is a wanted criminal and please arrest them, and the AI making a report to an individual saying this is someone who looks like they might be on our system, you probably need to subject them to some further scrutiny. And then the staff member who's been appropriately trained going and subjecting them to a certain degree of human surveillance, or maybe going up and asking them questions, again, sort of depending on the environment and what you're looking at. So that's the sort of process flow of what goes on. Now, in terms of use cases, I've sort of touched on this already, but there are a number of particularly high-profile use cases in the law enforcement space, and I'll just speak about those very quickly. There have been a number of trials in South London, South Wales, a few places, I think in Manchester as well, where they've done sort of short trials to see whether individuals who are wanted criminals, so people who have evaded capture, maybe there are warrants out for their arrest, could be detected in crowds of passers-by. The camera would normally be mounted on a van or on a permanent structure, and they're scanning people, and then an alert is being given to police officers to intercept individuals who are thought to be matches and question them further and potentially arrest them. It's been problematic for a variety of reasons, which I'll come back to. Sometimes it will be van mounted. This is from the South Wales police trial, and then sometimes also for policing in situations where there are protests or disruption activity like that, using it to identify people who are recognised as being proponents of violence, proponents of extremism, to try and sort of weed them out of the crowd to prevent trouble. In the commercial case, there's probably a much wider range of uses, and this is really where the bulk of my work with clients has been. Now, I start with probably the most sort of high-profile negative example. This is the area outside of King's Cross. One of the factors that, generally speaking, is relevant to the lawfulness of commercial facial recognition is that you're using the technology within a defined area and one which is your own private land, so that you can appropriately inform people before they enter your premises, this is what we're doing, and people can make a decision whether they like that or not. In some circumstances, say for example, if you're using it for access control for a building, you might give people the option of going through that route and just walking through, or going through a different route and having to provide a pass do some other form of verification of their identity. One of the problems with the King's Cross trial was that it wasn't very apparent to people that they were in a private space. This is an area of land immediately adjacent to King's Cross Station. It's laid out like a plaza, and a lot of people walking through it will not have understood that they were on private land, or that moving into that terrain was going to expose them to be scammed in this way and have their images captured and processed. The notices were not terribly well done, and again, something we'll come back to, consideration hadn't really been given to the impact that this sort of quite intrusive technology would have on those individuals, and no real balancing exercise seems to have been done in considering whether or not, for the purpose that they were using it for, there was a sort of less intrusive way of achieving the same outcome. In Sweden, we've had and it was actually alluded to in one of the presentations this morning, a regulatory intervention against a school. Now the school sought to use the facial recognition to control access. Their thinking was, we want to improve the security of our students, and we want to do that by making absolutely sure that only people who are appropriately members of staff or members of the student body can come into the school. They did an impact assessment, but what they failed to do was to think about how they would authorise that activity, what the lawful basis for that activity would be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but fundamentally, the way they approached it was to ask all of the school children to give their consent. Now, in a couple of scenarios, consent is almost never going to be the right approach to that type of processing. One is where you are a school and you're dealing with minors, because how are they sensibly supposed to say no if an authority figure says to them, we need you to consent to this if you ought to carry on coming to the school. The other is between employers and employees. So again, there's that power imbalance. If an employer says to an employee, I need you to consent to this processing of your data, that will almost always not be valid consent. And so other lawful bases have to be found for processing if you want to do that. By contrast with those two examples, which have both attracted a lot of negative press coverage, and indeed in the case of the Swedish school, a fine from the regulator, this photo illustrates a use case that's been happening in London. And it's, one might think, extremely trivial compared to a lot of the things that I've been talking about. It's a bar that warns you when you arrive that facial recognition technology is in operation. And it's using that technology to scan the faces of individuals who arrive at the bar and make sure that the bar staff can serve them in the order that they arrive in. So this is basically avoiding the problem of having to stand there waving your £20 note or sort of desperately hoping to get served while other people sort of shoulder their way in. Now, despite the slightly sort of trivial nature of that, surprisingly it seems to have been fairly well received. A lot of people have still been perfectly happy to go to the bar, and generally they found it to be useful. One of the things that is a significant sort of difference between this approach and the others is that the organisation deploying the technology had answers for a lot of the questions that inevitably were raised by this. For example, what is happening to the data after you've captured it? Their answer, at the end of each shift, the servers are wiped down completely. The data does not travel off-site. So there's no sense of this being capture that's going to feed into part of some wider database, or that's going to be preserved for posterity or the future return of those individuals. They explained that they were only capturing a very narrow field of view. They publicised very clearly to people coming into the bar that this was in operation. And fundamentally it was a discretionary activity. It was something that people could choose to do or not do. There were plenty of other bars further along the street who weren't using this technology, and they accepted the risk, as you have to, I think, if you're a business that's looking at using facial recognition protection, that a certain percentage of your customers will prefer to go elsewhere rather than subjecting themselves to the scrutiny of that technology. But because they'd thought about all of these things ahead of time, because they had answers to those concerns, actually I think, generally it's been relatively well received, and people haven't expressed too much concern about it carrying on. In contrast, we have seen quite a lot of backlash, both from audiences but also from the music stars who were performing, on the use of facial recognition in sort of gigs and other larger venues. And I think one of the issues is that there, as is so often the case with sort of compliance around data protection, the rules and the regulations, the compliance with the notice of what they had to be told was all done in a slightly underhand way. It was tucked away in the terms and conditions, sort of on the back of tickets, or in a link on a page when you were booking the tickets on a website. And I think for me, any sort of cutting edge technology, any technology that gives people concern, there is an instinctive reaction. I see it regularly from clients. Oh, well, we're going to be careful. We don't really want to make it obvious that we're doing this because people will be concerned about it. And that fundamentally is the wrong way round when it comes to data protection. When it comes to data protection, the more concern you think there is going to be, the more overt you have to be in how you communicate that you're doing that. And if the answer is, actually, I don't think I can justify this to my customer base, I don't think I can justify this to my staff, that's a pretty strong clue that you shouldn't be doing it. Whereas if you've got a good, compelling case for the particular application that you're planning to use, and you can explain that clearly, and you can explain how you're safeguarding to make sure that any risks you've identified are appropriately mitigated, actually, people tend to respond well to that. People, do buy from companies that they trust with their data. That's not because those companies are doing less necessarily with the data, but it is that those companies are a lot clearer about what they are doing and what steps they're taking to anticipate the concerns that people have. And that's important because of this last example, that generally speaking there is a drive towards the use of technology for enhanced convenience. And nowhere is that more apparent really than in something like the airport scenario, where this is Schiphol Airport, but a trial is being run at the moment, or developed at the moment, at Heathrow, which the Information Commissioner's Office is actually sort of working with them to help to sort of steer them through the process of using facial and other forms of information capture to try and help people to move in a much more frictionless way through airports. Most flights, the time you spend at the airport is over 50% of the time that you spend in the plane. It's a very significant proportion of your total travel time. Now, what they say is, imagine that you were able, through having registered ahead of time, using your passport, using ID information that you've got to provide anyway, with a system that effectively just green lights you through, so that you can arrive at the airport and walk through, under scrutiny, sure, but walk through and end up getting on the plane. Now that has a great deal of attraction. A lot of people will trade an amount of privacy for the convenience that would give them. And that's fine. I'm not here to sort of say this technology should never be used. But if that trade is happening, it has to be clear what people are giving up and what they're getting. And so that comes down to really how do you sort of get into the legal compliance space where you can ensure that you've communicated transparently what are you doing, what information are you going to collect, how are you going to protect it, and all of these sort of things. So that requirement is triggered by the fact that you're collecting personal data. I put the definition there. It should be one that's probably familiar to most of you. And I've already talked about biometric data, which is the particular measurements and technical information that relates to something distinctive and unique about individuals, in this case, measurements from facial dimensions. Now, when you are processing personal data at all, again, this will be sort of fairly familiar stuff to you all, you've got to have a lawful basis. If you're processing, you've got to have all of these other principles adhered to. And I want to just, in the time that's remaining, sort of canter through those relatively quickly. But I did just want to sort of draw attention to the fact that it's not enough to comply with these. You've got to make sure that you're documenting them appropriately. So lawfulness requires you to sort of think about how you actually justify that processing. Now, there's been a recent case, which is the first case on facial recognition. It was in a law enforcement context, but it was Bridges versus the South Wales Police. Mr. Bridges, with the support of Liberty, challenged the facial recognition trial that took place in South Wales. He was someone who wasn't on the list of the watch list of people who were to be looked out for. So his data was captured, it was compared against that watch list, it was deleted almost at once. One of the things that the court considered in trying to decide whether or not there was a case here that he could pursue was looking at, well, what was the lawful basis for the activity that the police carried out. As I've said, when you're the police, there's a law enforcement factors that aren't available to businesses in the private sector, but I've sort of listed here some of the considerations that you would have to think about. And of course the fact that when you're using biometric data to identify individuals, you don't just have to think about the standard lawful basis for processing, but also those conditions at Article 9 that relate to special category data. There, again, explicit consent, which I think is no more useful than actual consent in these environments. Sometimes it will be necessary for employment purposes. Sometimes it will be something that you're processing to exercise or defend legal claims. If you're collecting data in order to identify individuals who are committing vandalism against premises, you might or you're using it in a security system on a vehicle or a building, you may well be able to justify it on that basis. It is also at least arguable that in the case of facial data, this is data which is manifestly in the public domain. If you go to the supermarket or the department store or just walk down the street, you expect to be recognised. You don't expect necessarily that your fingerprints will be taken. You don't necessarily expect that other information about your identity or email address or your credit card will be broadcast to the world to see. But it won't surprise anyone if one of their neighbours, one of their friends comes up to them in the street and says, "Oh yeah, I thought it was you," because their face is there. It's on public display and it's recognisable. So, I do think that needs to be considered. But again, I've mentioned this point. Having those purposes, having a lawful basis is not enough. You have to be communicating. You have to be fair and transparent in what you're doing. Now, one of the other key legal sort of data protection principles that you have to be thinking about with facial recognition is the purpose limitation. That you're not processing the data any longer than necessary, and that you're not collecting any more data than is necessary. One of the things that I've seen, again, several times is a suggestion, well, maybe we'll start off using it to protect our staff, but maybe we can move into using it for other purposes. Maybe we can move into using it to offer sort of marketing that's tailored to individuals. That's very, very difficult to do. You have to think at the outset about how you're going to use the system and then deploy it appropriately. But having an ulterior purpose in mind that you don't declare almost certainly invalidates any sort of attempt that you've made to be transparent and open. And again, I'm running a bit low on time, so I'm just sort of cantering through these, but some of the other limitations and principles that you have to think about. But I do want to just spend the last couple of minutes talking about these points. There is at the moment, a real issue with a lot of the algorithms that are used in facial recognition. And it is probably the one thing that ought to give people pause before they sort of race ahead with it. Certainly they would need an answer from their supplier about how this is being addressed. And that is that a lot of the data sets that have been used to train facial algorithms have used information that was available to the Western sort of tech companies that were developing these algorithms. So there's a very strong preponderance of male over female faces. There's a very strong preponderance of white, sort of Caucasian over coloured faces. And these things are problematic because it means that those people who are less well represented tend to be detected more frequently. So if you're someone of colour, you are more likely to be wrongly detected as being on a watch list than someone who is white, because the system is just less good at making fine distinctions between facial characteristics. I put that statistic on there about accuracy being fairly mixed. This is the Metropolitan Police trial in London. 81%, that sounds like a relatively good statistic until you know that that is 81% wrong. When they were detecting people, and bear in mind that the impact on that particular trial was that if someone was detected, they were approached by a uniformed officer, questioned, and almost invariably arrested. 81% of the time, they got it wrong. And a lot of that, because of where they were operating in London, was down to inaccuracies that resulted from racial bias in the underlying algorithms. So there is a lot of work still to be done. This is not, at the moment, technology that I would be sort of saying that anyone ought to be approaching with sort of confidence or in a very sort of laid-back way. But it is, I think, equally technology that is coming through. It is technology that, for the reasons I've talked about in terms of convenience, in terms of user expectation, let's face it, people are being trained by Facebook, by their phones, to recognise facial as a method of unlocking devices, of gaining access, of verifying identity. And they're going to expect the sort of convenience that goes along with that, and they're going to expect that sort of thing is a route for them to access or to identity verification. So it's important as businesses to be aware of the limitations, sure, for technology, but also of the fact that it is likely to be coming through in a more pronounced way, that the demand for it, that the pressure to use it is going to increase, and that when you come to do that, firstly, almost invariably you will need to do that as part under a data protection impact assessment, but also you need to think about all of these other factors. Think about, is it really the best way of achieving what you want to do, and if it is, how can you limit what you're capturing, and how can you provide transparent information to make sure that people who have concerns can get answers to those concerns and be comfortable in what's happening. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Thank you very much for listening. I am around, so I don't know that there is time now for questions. No, there isn't. But I am around, and if anyone wants to come up to me, you will recognise me by this face.
Thank you, Will.